We'll begin using the Middle East as kind of an example. We will talk about the processes through which domestication and agriculture emerged in the Middle East, and then we will kind of broaden our treatment of it to other areas of the world. There are a lot of similarities. Agriculture was independently invented in 7 different world areas. The actual crops that were domesticated vary somewhat, and the lifestyles of the people perhaps that were domesticating crops vary somewhat, but the same sorts of processes, the same sorts of environmental conditions, etc., result in these similar solutions. We call this independent invention, and this is we talk specifically about the independent invention as kind of the natural outgrowth, the um, mutually agreed upon solution that can arise independently in different areas of the world. And so, as as this transition period occurs, and there's climate change and population growth combined, it's just logical that the next step then is to start to intentionally plant and control the reproduction of certain suites of resources. We will then branch, or of course, talk about other areas of the world. The reason that we talk about the Middle East is there are multiple reasons for that. One, we've had human populations in the Middle East for a very, very long time, right? We had Homo erectus populations in the Middle East. We had Homo um, heidelbergensis. We had Neanderthals in the Middle East. Middle East represents this point of divergence between Neanderthals and Denisovans, and so then naturally we've had uh, anatomically modern Homo sapiens living in the Middle East for a very long period of time. It is this pathway essentially out of Africa, but the real advantage of archaeology in the Middle East has to do with the climate, right? We when we look at areas that have sandy soil relative to moister, kind of denser, or like clay soil, perhaps, right? It's easier to sift through sandy soils when we've got such a long history of human habitation. As you start to build new developments, you unearth archaeological remains. It's kind of an arid, slightly dry climate, which also means that a lot of things don't decompose, rather, they're preserved. So, there are a number of reasons why, logically, the Middle East was kind of where we started um, our interest in archaeology. We also, I mean, we have to be honest about the origins of anthropology, right? The Middle East has been of economic interest to Western countries for a very long period of time. And so a lot of our interest, though we say it's academic, right, uh, certainly is ushered into the Middle East on the coattails of colonialism, right? So as colonial um, governments were seeking to control access to things like petroleum products, crude oil, etc., in the Middle East. That ushered the way for scientists to follow to really start to study both current people and people in an archaeological context. All right, so Middle Eastern food production arose in the context of 4 tightly juxtaposed environmental zones in the Middle East, in this area of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, of course, right? You've learned in high school that this is the quote unquote cradle of civilization. What we see is a river valley. In this case, it was, of course, 2 rivers. And this confining of the independent invention of agriculture in river valleys in the old world certainly has kind of a logical reason behind it. So, this river valley, or this rapid kind of vertical relief in Mesopotamia, included the high plateau, which was at about 5,000 feet elevation, the Piedmont steppe, which was a treeless plain that had a lot of grasses that were growing throughout it, The alluvial desert, this is the specific area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which has seasonal flooding. And then the hilly flanks. The hilly flanks were between the Piedmont steppe and the alluvial desert. So at the very bottom, between your rivers, you've got this alluvial desert. As you go up in elevation, the hilly flanks come before the Piedmont steppe. And this was a subtropical woodland zone that flanks those rivers to the north. We have had competing ideas as to what were the reasons why domestication initially started. And so early on, people thought that it was people who were living in regions outside of high production who were just watching these high producers and kind of copying their behaviors. This idea that plant cultivation and animal domestication began in areas that had reliable rainfall. So the hilly flanks were an area where you had an abundance of things from trees as well as grasses that were growing. And so you had wild stands of wheat and barley. And Robert Braidwood is one of the archaeologists who's done a lot of work with these, particularly with the Natufians who were living in this area of the Middle East. Deliberate cultivation, however, comes then in response to climatic changes. So the people who live in the richest areas, the Natufians that were inhabiting these hilly flanks, for example, they didn't start by deliberately cultivating. What happened was that they would carry seeds with them throughout their movements, and those seeds would get dropped. And so, in areas outside of the hilly flanks, you would start to see stands of barley rise as well. This deliberate cultivation, though, doesn't come until something changes in the climate, because as long as your habitat can support um, your population size without much difficulty, you're not going to see a transition to farming. There have been some interesting studies addressing kind of the energetic expenditure and the quote unquote work that people have to do in hunter gatherer communities as compared to farming communities. And hunter gatherers, provided they live in a rich enough environment, don't really have to work very much. There's been some detailed work done with the Ache of Paraguay, the Hiwi of Venezuela, where hunter gatherers on average, women work about 2 hours per day. Men might work between about 2 and 7 hours per day. In terms of work that is specifically devoted to um, accruing, acquiring resources. So some hunts may take 7 hours for men, but they also don't hunt every day. They may hunt only 2 or 3 days of the week. The gathering production tasks of women may only require 2 to 3 hours a day of work for them to get enough for the evening meal, and then the rest of that day will be devoted to childcare, to um, fostering social relationships, to cooking and taking care of, you know, like weaving baskets and such. So other tasks, but in general, hunter gatherers have a lot of free time. That, of course, would vary seasonally, and we can't negate the fact that it's hard work to be able to hunt, but you don't have to hunt every day, right? And widespread food sharing also kind of equalizes the caloric intake among your group. So when we compare that to the kind of work that farmers do, just think about like our tales of farmers, right? Life on the farm. What time do you get up? Well, you get up at the crack of dawn. You get up with the rooster when he crows, right? You've got to milk your cows. You've got to be out in the fields, weeding, watering, all of that kind of work. And it really, I mean, even if we just look at like pop culture references to farms, right? Farms require a lot of physical labor, and that's true in the archaeological record as well. I mean, farming work really becomes the area in which the elite start to exploit those that don't have access to resources, right? That a lot of that day in, day out labor is done by people in lower socioeconomic strata. And it results in overproduction, and kind of allows for a central storehouse and such. So nobody like willingly is excited, let's say, about making that transition from hunting and gathering to farming. But what happens is the climate changes ever so slightly, or the population density rises enough that foraging for resources can no longer support the size of the population that you have. And that is really where we see this transition point. And so the Natufians, between about 12,800 years and 10,200 years before present, they were central place, sedentary village living hunter gatherers. They had a diet that consisted of gazelles that were solitary and required also solitary hunting rather than group-wide hunting. They lived in an area that had natural stands of wheat and barley. And so they were able to go ahead and start to shift some of their diet over to these wild grown grains as their population densities rose. They tried to maintain the productivity of their climate in or their environment in the face of more mouths to feed, basically, and would transfer these wild cereals to well watered areas. I don't mean watered with well water, I mean areas where rainfall was pretty consistent. So, what happens is as people start to have trouble following their traditional subsistence strategy, they become open to other techniques. They become open to changes in the way in which they get their food. And that's exactly what happens in the Middle East after about 10,000 years ago. Sedentary life developed before farming and herding. The Natufians had villages that were occupied year round. They show permanent architectural features and evidence for the processing and storage of wild grain. So we not only have, let's say, the footprints of homes, but we also have areas where any surplus would have been stored. One important point, the village that the Natufians resided in is now in present day known as Jericho. And Jericho has been continuously inhabited for more than 10,000 years. The homes that the Natufians built were roundhouses and they were not densely packed. And so, as we go through kind of successive excavations in cities like Jericho, right, the deepest areas you find these round kind of dispersed houses. Those eventually are destroyed, and houses are converted to rectangular shapes, so the walls can be flush with the walls of other houses, and you can pack more people into that same area. Um, One key environmental feature that assists or makes the development of the independent invention of agriculture much more likely is called a vertical economy. Okay, what a vertical economy means is that you've got closely juxtaposed environmental zones, and so we see this happening in these great river valleys, to where the lowest areas you've got your river itself, and that as you climb up to the highest elevation areas, you cycle through or transfer between different ecological zones that have different kind of environmental conditions. You see this as we drive up the Sandias if you go to the east side of Albuquerque, right? That the foothills of the Sandias are very much like many of the other areas of high desert around New Mexico. But as you start to drive up the crest road, you see rainfall changes, you see temperature changes, you see changes in the prevailing vegetation. And so that happens anywhere where you have mountains. So, specifically, the vertical economy occurs when you exploit these closely juxtaposed environmental zones during different seasons. And so you may drive your livestock or move your people down into the valley, the river valley during winter, right? That's going to be the area that's warmest, it's going to be the least covered with snow, etc. But as spring comes, you start to climb up into higher elevations, and in the heat of the summer, perhaps it's too hot down in the river valley, right? And so instead, you drive both livestock and people up to the higher reaches of the mountain. And so this movement of people, animals, and products between these environmental zones is a precondition for the emergence of food production. As you move between zones, you take food sources with you. These grains that were prevalent in the hilly flanks, the Natufians took with them into the Piedmont steppe and up into the high plains or the high plateau as they moved up the mountain. And so, what that does is that creates stands of grains at different elevations that ripen at different times of year. So, you can grow and exploit and utilize these grains in the valley or the lowest zones during the winter. Spring and fall, you're going to use the middle elevation areas for these grains. And then in summer, you might grow these grains at a high elevation. We have essentially a regional vertical economy in New Mexico. So what we see is down south, we grow the things that really like the hot weather. So specifically, right, all of our chili is grown in the south. In the middle Rio Grande Valley, in the area here around Albuquerque, you can get a wide variety of plants. You've got watermelon, you've got other squashes, you've got tomatoes, potatoes, all sorts of things that do well with the moderate length growing season that we have here in Albuquerque. But as you go up north, like to Taos and Chama and such, the growing season gets a lot shorter. And so in those areas, it's going to be fast growing, colder weather plants like greens and such. And so we can see that even traditionally in New Mexico, that this regional area exploited these different environmental zones and traded crops to be able to have variety. So, with domestication comes specific genetic changes. And so, we'll talk about the changes that we see in plants, and then we'll talk about the changes that we see in animals. Domesticated crops, as opposed to wild crops, have larger seeds. The reasons they have larger seeds is, we're talking here specifically about cereal grains, right? Cereal grains have larger seeds because the seed is what we grind into flour. That's the part that we're actually eating. When we talk about something like the domestication of watermelon, that's not going to go for larger seeds. Instead, then we're going to foster or favor a reduction in the seed size because what we want is that fruit around the seed. We also then select for a higher yield per unit area. So this can include more seed heads per plant, for example, or pods that more pods that have these larger seeds. We favor a loss of natural seed dispersal mechanisms. Cereal grains, grass seeds, naturally are dispersed by wind, water, and animals. That's true of many crops, but when you think about those grass seeds, right? Think about any of you have dogs that like to go running through fields. If you do, you often have to check your dog for those grass seeds when they come back. There is a particular grass seed here called well, what is it called now? I'm spacing on it. It's a fox something, foxtail. Um, I can't remember, but I think it may be a foxtail that is like a corkscrew shape, and it's got all those little spiny things that catch on to the dog's fur so well. And that corkscrew shape of this particular seed then enables it to burrow into your dog's skin, which can lead to the development of a really nasty abscess. So, if your dogs like to run off leash, definitely check them over for grass seeds when they get back because there can be some serious veterinary problems that emerge from not removing those seeds. Right. So think about your dog running through grass that has gone to seed and how they come back with all of those things in their fur. We don't want that with domesticated crops. We also don't want seeds that naturally float away on the wind, right? We want seeds that stay connected to the plant until we're ready to harvest them. We don't want them to be dispersed through these natural mechanisms. We favor tougher connective tissue or the axes that hold these seed pods to the stem. That is part or kind of goes hand in hand with this loss of natural seed dispersal mechanisms. And then we want the seed coats, the husks, to actually be more brittle. There's this saying from wheat harvesting called that goes separating the wheat from the chaff, right? That's the expression. And traditional harvesting often takes place with baskets. And what you do is you fill your basket part way full with seeds and then you kind of gently toss it. And what that does is agitates the husks enough that they break apart. And then you toss it up in the air in a light breeze. And the wind's able to catch the husks and carry them away while the seed falls back into the basket. And so that kind of harvesting technique or processing technique was pretty widespread during the Neolithic. So we want those seeds to stay put until we're ready to harvest them. But once we harvest them, we don't want it to be hard to take the seed coat or the husk off of those seeds. When we look at domesticated animals as opposed to wild animals, we select for smaller body size. We want them easier to control. There is a species of recently extinct cattle called the auroch, Auroch, that was a Scottish Highland cattle that stood between 6 and 8 feet at the shoulder. Um, that was critical for that kind of Highlands ecosystem. They were large tramplers, and there are a lot of actually plants that rely upon the grazing action and that trampling that those large cattle do that modern species of cattle can't quite accomplish the same thing. And so genetic engineers are trying to reverse engineer the aurochs back into existence using existing species of Scottish Highland cattle. All right, so we don't generally want domesticated cattle that dwarf us in size because we're not going to be able to control them. Same thing goes for goats, for sheep, etc. We're going to select for smaller body size. We also will select for changes to their defense mechanisms, such as horns. If you go to McCall's pumpkin patch during the fall, right? You go and you feed the goats over in the petting zoo area. You'll notice they've got really, really weird looking horns. They've got horns that curl in on themselves. They've got horns that are just like little knobs that are deformed, etc. That is intentional. We want those defense mechanisms to be selected away because those are the things that can hurt us. Now, the problem is when we select those away, is that then our flocks cannot support themselves or defend themselves, right? And so this is another area where domesticated dogs have had a long hand-in-hand evolutionary process with people producing food, right? For dogs that function as like sheep herding dogs and such. Not only do they keep your flocks together and prevent stragglers from going off, but they also are there to protect the flocks when wild canids and wild felids, let's say mountain lions and wolves, come in to feed from your flocks. So when we select away their defense mechanisms, we build a reliance on us for defense. And then we favor other traits. For sheep and goats, this included the woolly coat. Sheep and goats were actually domesticated in the lower areas of Mesopotamia, and that woolly coat lifts the hair up away from the skin. So, as we look at how the hair is on these animals, it grows straight out of the shaft and then it corkscrews up. And so, when you kind of do that across the skin surface of your animal, you build in evaporative cooling because wind can blow um, just under where the hair starts to kink, and then that allows the skin to be cooled off even without like sweat glands and such. And so that's how they were better adapted to this hot, dry alluvial lowlands. And then the added benefit, like the woolliness was actually selected for thermal regulation, but then had the added benefit of giving us clothing or the way that we were able to harvest the wool for clothing.